The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. We open our proceedings here with the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Taylor Green, to lead us for that purpose.
To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on the dangers and due process violations of gender-affirming care for children.
I have a point of order.
Yes, ma'am. What's the point of order?
It is not the committee's practice to allow folks who are not members of this committee to sit at the dais without unanimous consent, and we do not give it.
I was going to seek that unanimous consent. The gentlelady from Georgia was here for the purpose of merely introducing the Republican witnesses. And it's common courtesy among colleagues to allow a member the privilege of appearing for that purpose, and I'm sorry that you object to that.
Sorry, too.
You insist on the point of order?
I do.
Unfortunately, it's not a debatable motion or one that is subject to a vote, so I will provide the witness introductions after our opening statements. I thank our colleague for her willingness anyway. I will recognize myself for an opening statement, and we'll get the hearing going here. Before I provide a few opening remarks, I'm going to play a 2-minute excerpt of a podcast interview with an individual named Dr. Blair Peters at the Oregon Health Science University in Portland. He calls himself the queer surgeon, and he boasts about the shocking, fully experimental, irreversible, and life-altering invasive procedures that he and others are performing on children to surgically modify their genitals. I want everyone to hear this in his own words, not mine, and take special note of the frank admission that no one has published any studies on these shocking procedures, and they are, quote, as he says, just kind of learning and figuring out what works, unquote. Later in this video, he admits to performing, quote, huge reconstructive surgery, rearranging anatomy, and then acknowledges that they know almost nothing about the outcomes for these children. And, quote, he says, we'll know more in 5 to 10 years, and, quote, it'll be fascinating to see how all these kids turn out. Wow. With unanimous consent, I will enter the link to this full video in the record of our hearing because everyone should watch it. It is absolutely nightmarish and surreal to hear the description of what these people are doing to the bodies of young children. Please play that clip, and I will say viewer discretion is advised.
So 80% or so of my practice is gender-affirming surgery. So I do facial, chest surgery, and genital surgery. But the majority of my practice and sort of where my passion lies is really genital surgery cases. So I do a lot of vaginoplasty and a lot of phalloplasty. I would just say they're expanding in either direction. So yeah, a lot of adolescents presenting for surgical intervention, but also a lot of people that are like in their 70s sometimes coming in for genital surgery, and then everything in between. But the adolescents for sure present some unique challenges. Obviously, there's great evidence supporting pubertal suppression for a whole variety of benefits. But the one thing that is very new is genital surgery in someone that has underwent pubertal suppression. Not so much an issue in someone with assigned female at birth anatomy that undergoes a phalloplasty, because we're creating something with a free tissue transfer or a flap anyway, but a much bigger issue for an individual that's undergoing a penile inversion vaginoplasty, because we use all of that tissue to basically create the vulva as well as line the internal vaginal canal. And as a specialty, those of us that do a fairly high volume of genital gender-affirming surgery, we've maybe done a handful of pubertally suppressed adolescents as a field, and no one's published on it yet. OHSU we're just putting our first series together as we're kind of learning and figuring out what works. But it's really changing things because you don't have enough tissue to line the vaginal canal. So you either have to take a skin graft or take skin from elsewhere or use some artificial product. The way that we're dealing with it is by using a robot, and we're basically performing intra-abdominal components of the surgery. So We're using peritoneum, which is the inner lining of the abdomen, to line most of the vaginal canal. And by doing that, that allows us to use all of the remaining tissue externally to create a vulva and try to make also an aesthetic result.
So I'm going to speak the truth here plainly, and I think the vast majority of the American people understand and agree with what I'm going to say. What you've just heard there is a little sample of barbarism. This is the mutilation of children, and it should be prohibited by our law. This so-called gender-affirming care is anything but affirming and caring, and the language matters. This is adults deciding to permanently alter the bodies of children who do not have the capacity to make life-altering decisions on their own. And here's some more plain truth that everybody acknowledged until about 15 minutes ago. It's been plainly observed and fully respected by every culture for all of recorded history. Sex isn't something you are assigned at birth. It is a natural prenatal development that occurs when every unborn child is in the mother's womb. No one can surgically free themselves from this objective and obvious fact of life or free anyone else from it. But today, we see adults inflicting unspeakable harms on helpless children to affirm the adult's own worldview, that gender is somehow fluid, that sex can be surgically altered, that there are no lasting consequences of all this madness as a result of the sex change procedures. What is even more alarming is that the central tenet of the transgender movement and its allies is to exclude parents as much as possible from making decisions about the health of their own children. Medical professionals and schools increasingly see parents as, quote, transphobic bullies who must be prevented from standing in the way of the medical sexual transition of their own kids. We saw this in my home state of Louisiana recently, where Children's Hospital of New Orleans laughed in the face of a young girl's parents when they attempted to intervene as doctors sought to transition their daughter without their consent. To the left, these aren't your children, see? They are the state's children, and the state should be making the parenting decisions. Let's also be clear about something else. Even a parent has no right to sexually transition a young child. Our American legal system recognizes the important public interest in protecting children from abuse and physical harm. No matter how liberated you may be, you still don't have the legal right to ignore seatbelt safety laws or minimum driving age laws or drinking and smoking laws for your kids. No parent has a constitutional right to injure their children. Of course, the reach of radical sexual identity politics isn't limited to young children alone. We see this extended to young adults, especially at the university level now. The modern left applauds men competing in women's college athletics. We see universities captured by academics advancing this ideology on students across our country. Whether it's by scalpel or by social coercion from teachers, professors, administrators, and left-wing media, it's an aggressive attempt to transition the young people of our of our country. They're doing this psychologically, and now they're doing it even physically. Something has gone terribly wrong. And deep down, everybody in this country knows it. Today, we want to shed light on what this problem is and hopefully how we can address the problem. Contrary to what some of my Democrat colleagues believe, the scourge of radical gender ideology is very real. The efforts to cover up what's being done to our children are extreme, and the science is on the side of what we all know deep down is morally and ethically right. I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses as we unravel the narrative surrounding this so-called gender-affirming care. And I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's be clear. Congress has no business interfering in parents' freedom to make decisions about appropriate medical care for their children. The idea that politicians are more qualified to judge the medical value or necessity of gender-affirming care than every major medical organization is absurd. Holding a hearing to substitute far-right ideologies for parental judgment exposes the rank hypocrisy of the party claiming to value individual freedom and small government. And so here we are before the Subcommittee on the Constitution and Limited Government. Make no mistake, today's hearing is not about protecting children or parents' rights. It's a cynical and frankly dangerous political attack on transgender children and their families, driven not by science or facts, but by polling and political strategists determined to mobilize conservative voters through fear. So let's start by setting the record straight. Gender-affirming care is safe and effective. It is supported by every major medical association, including the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the American Medical Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, among others, representing over 1.3 million American doctors. It's just not up for debate. The partisans who characterize gender-affirming care as radical gender ideology are just repeating right-wing talking points to delegitimize critical health care. Access to gender-affirming care is essential to the mental health and well-being of trans youth. This care is tailored to both the mental and physical health needs of patients, as well as their developmental stage in life. And the parents and guardians of these children are involved in every phase of decision-making. There's nothing radical about that. So when our Republican colleagues allege that gender-affirming care raises particular dangers or due process issues, that is fear-mongering at its worst, picking on already vulnerable kids in order to stir up chaos that they hope to ride to success at the ballot box, no matter how deceitful or dangerous those claims are. As a mother of three, I certainly never found myself at my children's pediatric appointments wishing for medical advice from the House Judiciary Committee. As a member of Congress, I'm appalled by the weaponization of our legislative process to inject politicians into the personal medical decisions of our constituents' lives. I strongly oppose any effort to impose ultra-conservative political or religious views on the medical decisions of American families, whether on matters of reproductive health care or parental decisions to seek gender-affirming care for a transgender child. I know that Americans can be trusted to make their own healthcare decisions without politicians invading their doctors' offices. And I believe parents and doctors when they say that gender-affirming care has changed children's lives for the better, and in many cases even saved those lives. Parents like the mother of a trans teen from Ohio, who shared her family's story with the committee. She told us that because her 17-year-old trans daughter had access to evidence-based, medically necessary, gender-affirming care, puberty was just another phase of a normal and healthy adolescence. She said, and I quote, "Forcing her to go through the wrong puberty and seeing the impact on her body and her mental health would have been agonizing for all of us. I don't understand why we would allow politicians to make medical decisions for our children." She's right. Banning access to gender-affirming care would violate parents' due process rights, and the federal courts agree. They agree that banning gender-affirming care for minors violates constitutionally protected parental rights, and that politicians should stay out of those decisions. I want to close by reminding my colleagues how much their words matter. By endorsing falsehoods and bullying tactics, members of Congress are helping to promote a culture of discrimination that has increased violence against trans kids and their parents. Cynical political opportunists should not be allowed to use the megaphone of the House Judiciary Committee to promote cruelty and disinformation, particularly when we know that it invites discrimination and abuse of trans children and their families. I must object to this callous and reckless use of this committee's time. And with that, I yield back.
I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement, if he wishes.
Mr. Chairman, today's hearing is an all-time low for the Republican majority. In my 3 decades in Congress, I have taken part in plenty of hearings where I did not agree with the choice of topic, to say the least. But I am absolutely disgusted by the Republican majority's bullying, bigoted framing of an issue that would otherwise be worthy of serious discussion. What we are witnessing today is nothing less than a taxpayer-funded platform for congressional Republicans to bully transgender kids who are already some of the most vulnerable members of our community. Things are already tough enough for these kids and their parents. A mental health survey conducted by the Trevor Project found that transgender youth experience high risk of depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. It can't help that they are under siege by Republican-dominated state legislatures hell-bent on passing anti-trans bills. According to the Human Rights Campaign, more than 76 of these bills have been signed into law, resulting in transgender youth losing access to life-saving medical care, comprehensive and inclusive education, and activities, spaces, and facilities. That is why it is so infuriating that congressional Republicans are using their megaphone to single out transgender kids and their parents by labeling their very existence to be a social problem, practically accusing their parents of being criminals for seeking safe, life-saving, mainstream medical treatment for their children. The last thing trans kids and their parents need in their lives is for politicians in Washington to jump on the anti-trans bandwagon just so that they can fearmonger for their 5 minutes of fame. Let me be crystal clear. Government should not stick its nose into a parent's decision to seek gender-affirming care for their children. Indeed, it is almost comical that the Republican majority of what they have named the Subcommittee on the Constitution and Limited Government is holding a hearing allegedly on due process to argue that politicians, not parents, should make decisions as to what medical treatment is best for their children. The legal theory underlying this farcical hearing is bogus, but you don't have to take my word for it. Every federal district court that has considered the constitutionality of state laws banning gender-affirming care has ruled that such bans violate parents' constitutional rights. These decisions were issued by courts in different parts of the country and by judges from across the ideological spectrum, including 3 judges appointed by former President Trump. I trust parents and medical professionals, not politicians, to make decisions about their children's health when it comes to gender-affirming care, and so does the Constitution. That said, judging from the lineup of witnesses, it appears that there is no limit to the topics over which Republicans want to bully trans kids and their parents today. Undoubtedly, transgender youth's participation in sports will be discussed because Republicans think it is a winning political talking point. But the facts do not justify the fears that Republicans and their political allies gin up over the fairness of trans girls participating in girls' athletic teams, nor the further stigma it attaches to transgender children. What recently happened in Utah illustrates my point. Last year, Republican Governor Spencer Cox vetoed a complete categorical ban on transgender kids from participating in athletics matching their gender identity, which the Utah legislature sadly overrode. In vetoing the law, Governor Cox noted in a letter explaining his decision that of the 75,000 high school kids participating in high school sports in the state, only four were transgender. And only 1 transgender student was playing girls' sports. 1 out of 75,000. Governor Cox also noted a study that showed that 86% of trans youth reported suicidality, and 56% of trans youth have attempted suicide. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. A majority of trans youth in this study reported that they attempted to kill themselves. And out of 75,000 high school student athletes in the state, only 4 were transgender, an infinitesimally small minority of all high school students in Utah. Governor Cox's letter further described a sentiment that I sincerely wish his Republican colleagues on this subcommittee shared. The governor wrote, quote, "Rarely has so much fear and anger been directed at so few. I don't understand what they are going through or why they feel the way they do, but I want them to live. And all the research shows that even a little acceptance and connection can reduce suicidality significantly," close quote. Parents of transgender kids want the same things every parent wants for their kids: to go to school without fear of bullying, to participate in extracurricular activities like sports if they wish, and to be accepted by their peers and their community. This hearing will only further put those things out of reach for those parents and their children. And far from protecting children, this hearing will only further stigmatize and endanger them, because it sends a message that transgender kids and their parents do not deserve the law's protection. To any transgender people or family members who may be watching this hearing, I want to say that Democrats in this committee see you, We appreciate you, we value you, and we will continue to fight for you. This hearing is a despicable exercise and a contemptible use of the subcommittee's time and power. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record, and we will now introduce today's witnesses. Ms. Paula Scanlon is a spokeswoman and an advisor to the Independent Women's Forum and the Independent Women's Voice. She's a former collegiate swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania, and she speaks out about what it was like for girls competing alongside and sharing a pool and locker room with a transgender woman. Ms. Chloe Cole is an advocate and someone who has experienced gender transition procedures. After being diagnosed with gender dysphoria, she began to transition, and then she detransitioned at age 17 and now speaks about her experiences. Ms. Taylor Green had wished to note today that she had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with Ms. Cole last year when you bravely spoke out and spoke in support of her bill, the Protect Children's Innocent Act, in front of the whole nation at a press conference. So thank you for your courage. Dr. Jennifer Bowens is serving as the director of the Center for Family Studies at the Family Research Council. Her research focuses on identifying and advancing policies that will best serve the health and well-being of families and communities. Ms. May Melman is a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Law Center. She previously served as the Deputy Solicitor General for the state of Ohio. Mr. Shannon Minter is the legal director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights. The NCLR advocates for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Ms. Miriam Reynolds is a licensed professional counselor and an art therapist. She's the mother of a transgender son and resides in the state of Texas. We welcome all of our witnesses and we thank you for your time in appearing today. We'll begin by swearing you in, so if you'd rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect the witnesses have answered in the affirmative, and y'all can be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered in the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask you to summarize that testimony in 5 minutes. You have a light system there, and you need to push the button to speak so we can all hear your voice. And Ms. Scanlon, we'll begin with you. You can go first.
Good morning, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Paula Scanlon, a spokeswoman and advisor for the Independent Women's Forum, and a former NCAA athlete. I am here today to share my personal story. I started swimming at a very young age, and by age 8, I was swimming competitively, and by late middle school, I was devoting at least 20 hours per week to swimming. I gave up countless Christmas holidays, weekends, and social events to work towards my goal of swimming Division I. A dream that came true when I began swimming for the University of Pennsylvania. While I am not an NCAA champion, I hold the New England Independent School League record in the 400-yard freestyle relay, a record that has stood since March of 2017. In September of 2021, Leah Thomas began participating as a member of the Penn women's team. Leah, formerly Will, had personal best times in every freestyle event that were faster than the women's world records. Once the season began, Thomas was leading the country in multiple events, while only placing in the top 500 in those events on the men's team. Thomas later became an NCAA champion in the 500-yard freestyle, the first NCAA champion in our women's team history program. While many of you already know this, what you do not know is the experiences of the women on the University of Pennsylvania swim team. My teammates and I were forced to undress in the presence of Leah, a 6'4" tall biological male, fully intact with male genitalia, 18 times per week. Some girls opted to change in bathroom stalls, and others used the family bathroom to avoid this. When we tried to voice our concerns to the athletic department, we were told that Leah's swimming and being in our locker room was a non-negotiable, and we were offered psychological services to attempt to re-educate us to become comfortable with the idea of undressing in front of a male. To sum up the university's response, we, the women, were the problem, not the victims. We were expected to conform, to move over, and shut up. Our feelings didn't matter. The university was gaslighting and fear-mongering women to validate the feelings and identity of a male. As an attempt to voice my concern about the situation we were forced into, revealing the unjust and unfair treatment, I wrote an op-ed for the Daily Pennsylvanian, the student-run newspaper. I approached this from a scientific, statistical perspective where I used my engineering background to discuss how Y chromosomes cannot be changed by any surgical procedure or systemic therapy. This biological fact lends itself to athletic advantages that cannot be mitigated by lowering testosterone levels, which are readily apparent in sports competitions and locker rooms. The Daily Pennsylvanian published my article on the evening of February 10th, 2022. Only a few hours later, my piece was retracted. I was given no notice nor reasoning. Again, I was silenced for my dissenting viewpoint and felt my First Amendment rights were denied by my university. This is representative of a greater issue, the destruction of free speech. Today, any discussion maintaining the sanctity of women's spaces is labeled transphobic, bigoted, and hateful. What's bigoted and hateful is the discrimination against women and the efforts to erase women and our equal opportunities, dignity, and safe spaces. One might ask, why do I speak so passionately about issues that seem hypothetical, or some may perceive as only impacting a small number of women? This is not hypothetical. This is real. I know women who have lost roster spots and spots on the podium. I know of women with sexual trauma who are adversely impacted by having biological males in their locker room without their consent. I know this because I am one of these women. I was sexually assaulted on June 3rd of 2016. I was only 16 years old. I was able to forgive my attacker, but violence against women still exists. Let us not forget the viral Me Too movement that empowered female victims to speak up. It casts a spotlight on the widespread prevalence of sexual assault and abuse, including in scholarly and educational institutions. Individuals on this committee have previously stated violence against women is all too common. I am grateful for those members who have brought awareness to the violence against women in the past, but unfortunately, there's still much to be done. As a sexual assault survivor, many policies pushed today completely ignore my experiences and many women like me. I ask the members of this committee, please consider this issue outside the lens of political affiliations and understand the true impact of ignoring the realities of womanhood. Future generations depend on us. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today.
And thank you for being here and for your courage, Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Cole, you're next, and you can begin.
Good morning. My name is Chloe Cole, and I am a detransitioner. Another way to put that would be, I used to believe that I was born in the wrong body, and the adults in my life whom I trusted affirmed my belief, and this caused me lifelong, irreversible harm. I speak to you today as a victim of one of the biggest medical scandals in the history of the United States of America. I speak to you in the hope that you will have the courage to bring the scandal to an end and ensure that other vulnerable teenagers, children, and young adults don't go through what I went through. At the age of 12, I began to experience what my medical team would later diagnose as gender dysphoria. I was well into an early puberty, and I was very uncomfortable with the changes that were happening to my body. I was intimidated by male attention, and when I told my parents that I felt like a boy, in retrospect, all I meant was that I hated puberty, that I wanted this newfound sexual attention to go away, that I looked up to my brothers a little bit more than I did to my sisters. I came out as transgender in a letter I sent on the dining room table. My parents were immediately concerned. They felt like they needed to get outside help from medical professionals, but this proved to be a mistake. It immediately set our entire family down a path of ideologically motivated deceit and coercion. The gender specialist I was taken to see told my parents that I needed to be put on puberty-blocking drugs right away. They asked my parents a simple question: would you rather have a dead daughter or a living transgender son? The choice was enough for my parents to let their guard down, and in retrospect, I can't blame them. This was the moment that we all became victims of so-called gender-affirming care. I was fast-tracked onto puberty blockers and then testosterone. The resulting menopausal-like hot flashes made focusing on school impossible. I still get joint pains and weird pops in my back, but they were far worse when I was on the blockers. A month later, when I was 13, I had my first testosterone injection. It's caused permanent changes to my body. My voice will forever be deeper, my jawline sharper, my nose longer, my bone structure permanently masculinized, my Adam's apple more prominent, my fertility unknown. I look in the mirror sometimes and I feel like a monster. I had a double mastectomy at 15. They tested my amputated breast for cancer. And I was cancer-free, of course. I was perfectly healthy. There was nothing wrong with my still developing body or my breasts, other than that, as an insecure teenage girl, I felt awkward about it. After my breasts were taken away from me, the tissue was incinerated. Before I was able to legally drive, I had a huge part of my future womanhood taken from me. I will never be able to breastfeed. I struggle to look at myself in the mirror at times. I still struggle to this day with sexual dysfunction. And I have massive scars across my chest. And the skin grafts that they took of my nipples are weeping fluid today. And they were grafted into a more masculine positioning, they said. After surgery, my grades in school plummeted. Everything that I went through did nothing to address my underlying mental health issues that I had. And my doctors, with their theories on gender, thought that all my problems would go away as soon as I was surgically transformed into something that vaguely resembled a boy. Their theories were wrong. The drugs and surgeries changed my body, but they did not and could not change the basic reality that I am and forever will be a female. When my specialist first told my parents that they could have a dead daughter or a live transgender son, I wasn't suicidal. I was a happy child who struggled because she was different. However, at 16, after my surgery, I did become suicidal. I'm doing better now, but my parents almost got the dead daughter promised to them by my doctors. My doctors had almost created the very nightmare they said they were trying to avoid. So what message do I want to bring to American teenagers and their families? I didn't need to be lied to. I needed compassion. I needed to be loved. I needed to be given therapy to help me work through my issues, not affirm to my delusion that by transforming into a boy, it would solve all my problems. We need to stop telling 12-year-olds that they were born wrong, that they are right to reject their own bodies and feel uncomfortable with their own skin. We need to stop telling children that puberty is an option, that they can choose what kind of puberty they will go through, just so they can choose what clothes to wear or what music to listen to. Puberty is a rite of passage to adulthood, not a disease to be mitigated. Today, I should be at home with my family celebrating my 19th birthday, and instead I'm making a desperate plea to my elected representatives. Learn the lessons from other medical scandals like the opioid crisis, to recognize that doctors are human too, and sometimes they are wrong. My childhood was ruined along with thousands of detransitioners that I know through our networks. This needs to stop. You alone can stop it. Enough children have already been victimized by this barbaric pseudoscience. Please let me be your final warning. Thank you.
Today's your birthday?
It is.
You're a beautiful, brave woman. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Ms. Reynolds, you're next. You may begin.
Good morning. My name is Miriam Reynolds. I'm a licensed professional counselor, a fifth-generation Texan descending from a long line of conservative Christians, and I'm the mother of a transgender son. I am honored to be here today to give my testimony and tell you the story of my incredible child. He recently became an adult, and I will still refer to him as a child. His name is Cameron, and he is 18 years old. He recently graduated from high school and is embarking on adulthood with a gap year before college. Cameron told us he was transgender when he was 11 years old. He was clearly dealing with something, but we didn't know what it was or how to help him. But then he told us. My husband and I had the same instinct to tell him that we love him no matter what and always will be there for him. We knew we needed to affirm him from our years in working with foster youth, but we had no idea what to do next. We were scared. We didn't know anyone who had a trans child. We had never even heard of gender-affirming care. I prayed that it was a phase, but already knew that it wasn't. The signs had been there all along, we just didn't understand them. We thought he was a tomboy. He refused to wear anything pink or girly and was the only girl on the boys' football team for many years. His best friends were always boys. There were a lot of signs looking back. As parents, all we really want for our children is for them to be happy and healthy. Prior to receiving gender-affirming care and socially transitioning, my child was not happy and was not able to be his true self. I didn't want him to have to face the struggles of being transgender, but I did want him to be happy and himself. At times, I grieved my little girl and felt as if she were gone. It was hard on me at first, but I was able to put my child's needs before my feelings and find him the care he needed. I could see that my child was happier and felt more and more comfortable the more he was affirmed. We were living in Colorado at the time, and through some research found a comprehensive program at a local hospital that provided health care to trans kids. We found him a counselor, immediately began trying to provide him with the best health care we could find. We felt very fortunate to have access to a multidisciplinary team of professionals who could help us figure out what options we had for Cameron's health care. I could not imagine having to manage legal restrictions of medical care in addition to talking to our extended family, all while learning ourselves about treatment options and caring for our child. Later that year, we decided to move to Texas. We began researching leading programs in the field of trans healthcare and were able to find a similar program. We chose to move to a town based on proximity to the clinic. We knew we needed the support of experts. We had an appointment scheduled before we even arrived in Texas or had any idea of our health insurance coverage. Our multidisciplinary team at the clinic consisted of physicians, nurses, social workers, psychologists, medical students, my son's counselor, the school counselor, my husband and I as parents, decision makers, and my son as a patient. We filled out many, many surveys and questionnaires. Myself, Cameron, and his dad were all required to do so. We had extensive interviews with social workers and psychologists who had requested a letter from Cameron's previous provider prior to our first appointment. The intake process was lengthy and meticulous. The process was daunting, but I was grateful that the team was so thorough. I want to make it clear that the care we received was slow, very thoughtful, provided with the utmost care and consideration. There was no rush, absolutely no coercion, lots and lots of double checking and making sure we were all on the same page. At the time, Cameron felt it was all moving too slowly. In retrospect, we can see clearly that it was the best thing for us to move so slowly on medical interventions so we could properly weigh the pros and cons. My son was asked at every appointment if he wanted to stop treatment or if he had any concerns about treatment whatsoever. Counseling was taking place the entire time. Cameron's counselor would also meet with the doctor and my husband and I before medical interventions were decided upon. The interventions my son has had with extreme consideration, consent, and discussion have been counseling first and foremost, puberty blockers, and hormone therapy. We have not even considered any kind of surgery, and my child is 18. If any physician or member of the treatment team had suggested surgery to us when Cameron was a child, we would have said no thank you and immediately gotten a second or third opinion. With the benefit of hindsight, I have no doubt that the health care my son accessed was life-saving. I'm grateful that we have had access to this incredibly crucial, medically necessary health care for our son without the interference of our government. Cameron is thriving now. He's doing better than he ever has. He has wonderful friends. He's dating a little. He has spoken out publicly and has the love and support of his whole family, including 2 grandparents who are staunch conservative Christian Republicans. We can all see that this is who he is. The grandparents don't fully understand what being transgender really means, but they love and accept him. I'm asking you today to please allow parents the right to access and consent for healthcare for their children. This decision should be made with parents, the child, and the child's medical providers without government interference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reynolds. Ms. Mailman, you're next. You may begin. Push that button for me there.
I'm May Mailman, Senior Fellow with the Independent Women's Law Center, the legal advocacy arm of Independent Women's Forum and Independent Women's Voice. I am also a mother to my 8-month-old daughter. I am testifying here today in support of her future, her freedom, and her equal opportunity. My fellow panelists have covered the pernicious effects of gender ideology on children and their futures. I'm here to address another way in which gender ideology destroys women and girls, and that is by dissolving legal protections for women in athletics. Until recently, female student athletes might have thought that they were protected by Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, and they were. That's because Title IX is very simple. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in programs run by schools that accept federal money, and that's basically all of them. And those programs include sports. Title IX recognizes that providing equal opportunity for the sexes can mean recognizing inherent differences between the sexes. That's why the Title IX statute explicitly allows schools to provide different living arrangements for the sexes. So too in sports. In introducing Title IX, Senator Birch Bayh explained that Title IX would not require sticking women on men's football teams, and that's why Congress explicitly asked that the initial Title IX regulations include reasonable provisions considering the nature of particular sports. And so for 50 years, the Title IX athletics regulation has explicitly permitted sex-based teams where selections for such teams is based on competitive skill or involves a contact sport. Importantly, the regulations also require that schools must provide equal opportunities for members of both sexes. Unfortunately, in April of this year, the Department of Education proposed a rule that, if adopted, would flip Title IX on its head. The proposed rule would modify the athletic regulation to let schools compete on teams consistent with their gender identity unless a particular school can demonstrate to the satisfaction of the Department of Education that this policy would be too unfair or unsafe. In other words, women are no longer granted female sports teams as a given. We have to prove that we need it. Of course, we do need it. Studies show that even testosterone suppression cannot eliminate the male advantage. Except schools are not going to be allowed to say that as a general matter, post-pubescent biological males playing women's sports puts female athletes at risk of injury and losing playing time, medals, and privacy. No, schools are going to have to prove to federal bureaucrats that allowing a biological male on a woman's team would be unfair or unsafe in this particular sport with respect to these particular athletes. No school is going to want to take on that litigation risk, and so schools are going to allow biological males to compete on women's sports. This will directly and overwhelmingly harm female athletes who are far more likely to be displaced by a male athlete than vice versa, and far more likely to face risks in private spaces like locker rooms. And even if it were a good idea to reduce educational opportunities for women like this, the Department of Education may not do so unless this body has authorized it. But Congress has done no such thing. The Department of Education says that the Supreme Court's decision in Bostick versus Clayton County means it can pretend that Title IX addresses gender identity. But the Department of Education is wrong. In Bostick, the Supreme Court said that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits employers from firing someone just because they are transgender. The decision says that an employee's sex is not relevant to the selection, evaluation, or compensation of employees. Athletics and education, however, is governed by a different law, Title IX. And when it comes to athletics, sex is not only relevant, it is often dispositive. As superstar Serena Williams said, men's and women's tennis are completely different sports. We live in a nation of laws and not bureaucratic command. That means the Department of Education must find its authorities in the laws that this legislative body has considered and passed. It may not use gender ideology to twist a simple anti-discrimination statute into a statute that reduces opportunities for women. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mailman. Mr. Minter, now you may begin.
Thank you. My name is Shannon Minter. I'm the legal director of NCLR. It's a legal organization that represents LGBTQ people. For my 30 years with NCLR, 20 years as its legal director, I've represented many transgender young people in cases involving discrimination and harassment in schools, in the child welfare system, the healthcare system, other areas. Recently, I've been involved in federal challenges to state laws that ban medical care for transgender young people and completely ban them from school sports. I really appreciate the opportunity to address this committee. You know, parents should have the freedom to make health care decisions for their transgender children. Parents want what's best for their children. Americans differ about a lot of things, but there is one point on which we strongly agree, and that is that parents, not the government, are best situated to make medical decisions for their own children. There's a lot of misinformation about transgender children, youth and adolescents. Gender dysphoria is very rare, less than 1% of the population. Most people in this country don't know a transgender person, much less have they met parents with transgender children. For most people, most legislators, this seems like a new issue, but medical care for transgender adolescents has been available for more than 20 years. The very same medications being prescribed for transgender youth have been prescribed for other young people for other conditions for more than 40 years. There is a substantial body of research that shows these treatments work. They improve mental health outcomes, quality of life, social relationships, family relationships. They dramatically reduce suicidality. One federal judge, after a full trial, said there is now extensive clinical evidence showing excellent results for these treatments. The medical standards for these treatments, as has been noted, have been endorsed by every major medical association in this country: American Medical Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Psychological Association, many more. These standards, they're evidence-based. They require a rigorous multidisciplinary assessment before diagnosing a child with gender dysphoria. They take a conservative approach to treatment. Those standards have been in place for a long time. They are not new. What is new is this recent massive overreach by state lawmakers to ban medical care for transgender youth. These laws, these recently passed state laws, they prevent doctors from doing their job. They prevent parents from getting the medical care that their children need. And that is why every federal district court, all 6 of them, after hearing all of the evidence, have concluded these bans violate parents' rights, they violate equal protection, and the claims they put forward to justify the bans have no basis. These decisions, as has been noted, have been issued by a wide range of judges: Arkansas, Alabama, Florida, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. In every case, the state officials supporting these bans had every opportunity to back up their false claims with actual evidence. Each case, they have failed. These bans pose a serious threat to the health and safety of transgender young people across the country, and I urge the members of this committee to reject any federal attempts to replicate that harm. As a transgender person myself, I have benefited from decades of access to health care, legal equality, support. I've been able to marry, have a family, pursue a career, participate in my local church and community. It is very disheartening to see the protections that have given me and other transgender people so many opportunities to thrive and to succeed now just being needlessly taken away from young people. Healthcare bans conflict with medical expertise. They rob parents of their right to make medical decisions for their children. They have devastating consequences for young people's lives. Decisions about children's medical care should be made by the parents who love them, not by politicians who know nothing about a child's life or history or circumstances, and who won't be the ones having to watch a young person they love suffer the devastating consequences of going without needed medical care. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minter. And Dr. Bowens, last but not least, you may begin.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Dr. Jennifer Bowens, and I'm a licensed therapist, clinical researcher, currently serving as the director of the Center for Family Studies at Family Research Council. Based on over 25 years of experience as a clinician providing trauma therapy to children, and as a researcher investigating the psychological effects of traumatic stress, I'm here to express my concern about what has been termed gender-affirming care. I've considered it a privilege to practice, research, and train future clinicians and be a part of a discipline aimed at protecting and bringing healing to the most vulnerable in our society, which are children. But when it comes to gender transition procedures, my field is not operating as a helping profession. Instead, it is actively causing harm. Historically, children have been treated as a special and vulnerable class in the psychological and research fields. Caution has been applied to children in light of the fact that they do not have the neurological capacity to understand lifelong decisions. Professional and research ethics tell us that we should proceed very cautiously with regard to interventions for children when empirical evidence is weak or the research methods are in the early phase, as with this case. We should avoid interventions that pose unnecessary risks, particularly when the symptoms are known to change with maturation. But risk avoidance is not what's happening with gender transition procedures. Instead, we have too many cases like Mike. Mike was 9 years old when he first saw a gender therapist. I was deeply saddened when I read his gender therapist case notes, where it was reported that Mike couldn't distinguish between fantasy and reality. Instead of investigating these symptoms, the therapist wrote in the treatment plan, which included puberty blockers, guidance on social transition, and education for future hormonal and surgical procedures. This treatment plan was enacted without regard for this child's known diagnoses of autism, possible OCD, and possible parental diagnoses, which were reported in the case notes. Mike is just one example of how so-called gender-affirming care is in direct opposition of our knowledge regarding development and our understanding of good research and treatment. And there are many reasons why I have concerns, but I'll just share a few with you. One, these interventions are being endorsed based on consensus, not evidence. In the case of gender-affirming care, the term evidence-based does not mean that this practice is standing on the merits of solid research findings addressing gender dysphoria. Instead, it refers to a vote by those who are ideological supporters of the practice. Compared to other psychological disorders found in the DSM-5 TR, gender dysphoria is currently being treated with the most invasive interventions connected to a psychological issue with the lowest quality of evidence to support that practice. And two, the success rates of non-intervention for gender dysphoria for children already exceed what most psychological interventions have. In most cases, 85% or more of those experiencing gender dysphoria will desist if they are left alone. This is a higher rate than most well-established and researched psychological interventions, and with success rates this high, it is actually unethical to intervene. Three, the research and practice around this issue does not properly account for competing diagnoses and variables. So in one example, a report from the UCLA Williams Institute found that 45% of transgender identifying people reported childhood sexual abuse. As a trauma clinician, I can tell you that when someone experiences sexual trauma, it is not uncommon for that person to hate parts of their body or want to get rid of those aspects of themselves that made them vulnerable to abuse. And four, it is often claimed that a failure to provide these interventions increases the risk for suicide. This approach is actually unethical, and it's a clear departure from the practice of empowerment and self-management, which are important goals of mental health practice. This claim is also not supported by the literature. Despite years of empirical study, there is no definitive understanding of the etiology in the suicide literature. Five, after a review of the literature, other countries have actually backed away from gender transition procedures, and the list now includes the United Kingdom, France, Finland, Norway, Australia, and Sweden. And six, gender-affirming care has created a monopoly on treatment options, as it demands that it is the only way to treat gender dysphoria. By comparison, we can look at Cochrane collaboration, for example. There are 245 meta-analytic reviews of varied treatment options for depression. Yet when it comes to gender dysphoria, there's only one path currently prescribed to help someone, and that's to become someone else. Researchers and clinicians should be innovating solutions to heal distress, not coercing kids onto a path that tells them that they need to remove or change physical parts of who they are in order to be whole. This is why I'm calling on you to act on behalf of children. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for that buzzer background noise. Didn't rattle you at all. We will now proceed on to the 5-minute rule with questions, and the chair recognizes first the gentlewoman from Wyoming for 5 minutes.
First of all, I want to say thank you for being here. You are 4 incredibly brave women, and you're my heroes. You have been willing to put yourselves out there to address something that many people want you to stop talking. They want to prevent you from talking. Don't listen to them. Make sure that you continue to use your voice to educate us, to educate the American people, because these children are worth saving. Dr. Bowens, I want to thank you for being here. And in your testimony, you referenced what I think is one of the more important points in this debate, and that children are treated as special and a vulnerable class in the psychological and research fields. You referenced the experience of at Tuskegee, and to me, the important takeaway here is that controversial so-called healthcare practices, treatments, and experience have not always withstood the test of time. Outside of your reference, I think of how lobotomy was once a form of care we wouldn't even consider today, and in fact has been banned in countries throughout the world. In this debate, I have wanted to replace the misleading terminology, gender-affirming care, especially as it relates to children, because one, it replaces the biological reality of sex, and two, because it falsely suggests that using the term affirming that there is anything good going on here. There are only two sexes, boys are girls, or boys are boys, yet girls are girls, and one cannot become the other. In fact, and especially when it comes to children, it seems to me that gender-affirming care is better described as sexual lobotomy. It is treatment that is fundamentally and permanently alters the sexuality and medical and psychological well-being of these patients. It causes irreversible sterilization and serious long-term medical complications and long-term reliance on pharmaceuticals. These treatments and surgeries are controversial medical practices that seek to change a person in a manner which is not actually achievable, and they will not withstand the test of time. Dr. Bowens, are there medical professionals in the US and abroad already rejecting these surgeries as any form of serious medical care?
Yes, thank you for your question. And we are seeing an increase of medical professionals speaking out. Just this past week, there were 21 doctors that came out and said, we are very concerned about this. The own AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics, was referenced earlier, and 80% of their membership has been asking for a review of the literature, and they've been denied that review by the upper echelon. So there are, and I've listed many other countries, there are people who are standing up because they're seeing the harms done to these kids like Chloe Cole.
Can you discuss why referring to these treatments as life-saving treatment is so extremely misleading?
Yeah, it's misleading for a number of reasons, because for one, the whole impetus of the scientific method is that we're discovering things. We're supposed to be in a process of, is this the right approach or not? And this whole discussion about saying that it's life-saving automatically says there's no room for discussion, there's no room for scientific inquiry, because the science is settled, which is it's an amazing statement, because the suicide literature has been around far longer than the transgender literature, and the suicide literature is not conclusive. So we have a real, right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing in this case.
It seems to me what we've been living through for the last couple of years is a government that wants to suppress any type of speech that it disagrees with. And we're seeing that with the industrial censorship complex that we've been talking about. And it appears that that's exactly what's going on here. They want to stop the debate because they know that they can't win it. Dr. Bowens, my last question is what is the success rate of sex change operations?
Well, we have, it's hard to find longer-term data with children, but what the data that we do have, which is probably the most reliable data point available, is from a Swedish study, and it looked at over 10 years, which is really important because regret doesn't just happen a year after some sort of transition. And what you see is a suicide rate that's associated with 19 times higher than the general population.
Well, actually, there is a 0 percent, there's a 100% failure rate for sex change operations, isn't there? Because it's not possible to change your sex?
That's right.
100% failure rate for these procedures.
That's right. You can't change your sex.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Minter, a federal court has stated that, quote, under the WPATH standards of care and endocrine society guidelines before puberty, treatment is focused on support for the child and family. Some prepubertal children may socially transition. No medical interventions are indicated or provided for the treatment of gender dysphoria in prepubertal children. Do you understand this to be a correct statement?
Yes.
Talk to the mic or into. Yeah.
It's actually not. Is the button red? Sorry.
Okay, there you go. My apologies. Yes, sir, that is 100% correct. Before puberty, there are no type of medical or medication interventions whatsoever. We're talking about transgender adolescents who've hit puberty and who would be eligible to be considered when it's medically appropriate.
What does the federal court mean in saying that, quote, no medical interventions are indicated or provided for the treatment of gender dysphoria in actually, you just answered that. What does the federal court mean in saying that some prepubertal children may socially transition?
Yeah, the only type of medical support or support offered to a transgender youth before puberty is to just let them be who they are. And I can't stress enough, this is about kids becoming someone they're not. This is about kids being who they are. So just allowing them to live with a name, clothing, etc., that reflects who they really are. And it's remarkable. They found that when research has found that when children are supported in that way, they are indistinguishable in terms of their mental health outcomes from non-transgender kids. They're just as healthy and really thrive when they get the support, that simple support that they need.
Thank you. Mr. Minter, what have courts said about laws that restrict transgender individuals' access to medically necessary care?
That they severely burden parents' fundamental rights to make medical decisions for their own children, and that they're blatantly discriminatory, that they violate the guarantee of equal protection because they do something that has just never been done before in this country, which is single out a particular group of people, transgender young people, in order to deny them medical care.
Thank you. Mr. Minter, a federal court has stated that, quote, the risks of gender-affirming medical care are not categorically different than the type of risks that other types of pediatric health care pose. For many adolescents, the benefits of treatment greatly outweigh the risks. Do you agree with this statement?
Absolutely.
What are the benefits of receiving gender-affirming care?
They're enormous. They produce positive mental health outcomes for these young people. They dramatically improve their quality of life. They do better in school. They develop positive social relationships. We heard that with Ms. Reynolds' testimony. Their relationships with their family improves, and their gender dysphoria is alleviated, and any depression, anxiety, suicidality is dramatically reduced. There's a study from 2022 that found a 73% reduction in suicidality among kids who had received this treatment.
Ms. Reynolds, thank you very much for being here today. Is there anything about you, your son, and other families like yours that you think the subcommittee and the American people should know?
I would like to just add one thing, if I could, and that is that with the sports debate, I just want to share my son's process with that. So, as I mentioned, he was the only girl on the boys' team for many, many years when he was a child, and when he transitioned, he completely dropped out of playing sports altogether. So that left a big hole in his life. That's nothing that he did anymore, and it was because he felt the pressure from all of this kind of political discussion around this, and dropped out completely. And I think that story is probably way more common than the isolated cases.
Thank you, Mr. Minter. What would you say about what we heard from Ms. Cole about her experience with gender care and her unfortunate experience?
I thank her for sharing that story and how I would respond. I think the most important thing to understand, that story is the exception, not the rule. Vast majority of young people who receive these treatments are getting them after careful assessment and because they really need them. This has actually been studied. We know that 98% of young people who receive these treatments continue to receive them into adulthood. I think what that reflects is the care behind these standards of care and the assessment process and the care with which gender specialty clinics in this country are providing this care.
So she is part of the 2%.
Apparently so.
Thank you. My time is expired. I yield back.
Gentleman's out of time. Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Well, I wonder first if Ms. Cole would like to respond to that.
I've yet to see a trans-identifying child who had a positive outcome with their transition. And the reason why most children who are affirmed continue on to transition, either as adolescents or as adults, is because once you've either socially transitioned or gone on blockers or started the other interventions like surgery or hormones, it's incredibly difficult to go back. The social ramifications are...
It's irreversible, and they have no choice at that point, is what you're saying.
in every single way.
There are two aspects to the question. Let me dispose of the first one involving sports, the fairness of allowing biological males to compete against females in sports. The second is a more complicated one, whether children should be subjected to irreversible transgender surgical or chemical procedures at all. But Ms. Scanlon, can you tell me if a female claiming to be a male has ever dominated in men's sports?
No, and actually in my league, there isn't 2 instances where a female athlete transitioned to the men's side.
So this is very much a one-way street.
Yes.
It's biological males competing against women dominate those sports. There's not a case of a biological female going transgender and dominating a male sport. Am I correct?
Yep, you're correct. And it's obvious that that would be the case because...
Well, if that's the case, then simply this is an attack on the integrity of women's sports. And I wonder why my Democratic colleagues, who often posture as feminists, can't see this plain truth. Ms. Scanlon, what would be wrong with simply allowing transgender men and women to compete in their own sports competitions while we preserve the fairness of women's sports?
Yeah, I believe all individuals should have a right to play sports. I think sex-based categories make the most sense.
So transgender males should be allowed to compete with other transgender males in their own sports category. Nobody's got a problem with that, I think.
Yeah, if that's what governing bodies decide is the fair solution, then I'm for that. I believe that female spaces should be protected and female sports teams.
Now the more weighty question is who should make the decision to subject a child to such a procedure on behalf of that child?
Nobody.
Well, long before governments existed, there were mothers and fathers who had children. So the family is the most fundamental governing unit. It's established by nature itself. So I think it therefore follows that parents have a fundamental natural right to raise their children according to their own best judgment. It can't be absolute, of course. You can't kill them. You have to feed them and clothe them and shelter them. And society has a role to play in being sure that you do. But it's intrusions into the decisions of parents over the raising of their children. That needs to be very cautious, very limited, and very humble. Now, the ranking member in her opening statement makes this point, once you strip away all of the partisan rhetoric, and it seems to me that there are 2 issues here. The first is the effort in states like California to bypass parents' judgment and subject their children to transgender procedures against the parents' judgment, or even to hide this from the parents. That's going on in California right now. So I want to be sure I understood the subcommittee's ranking member correctly. It sounded like she, too, opposes government replacing parents' judgment over the decision on transgender procedures for their children. Am I correct on that?
That's you, Ms. Scanlon. Yeah.
Am I correct on that? I yield to the gentlelady to answer.
I'm sorry, I was...
It sounded like you oppose government replacing parents' judgment over the decision of transgender procedures on their children. Am I correct on that?
What I said was that parents have the ultimate right to make the decisions concerning appropriate medical care for their children.
Then I think we're in agreement. We can take that off the table. Both parties oppose the government, any government, making decisions over whether a child will be subjected to transgender procedures contrary to the wishes of the parents. Do I understand that correctly?
I believe that's generally the legal standard,
Okay,
yes.
that's great. Then we need
Dispute
to
is
take
over what is appropriate, apparently.
If both parties support a law that forbids performing these transgender procedures on a minor without the full and informed consent of the parents, then, Mr. Chairman, I believe we should advance such a bill right away. I think that would address the fears that I hear from a lot of parents that their desire to protect their child is at risk from various state governments like California who are trying to usurp that decision. We have complete agreement on that.
I think you're
we should move that
mischaracterizing
bill
the
today.
complete agreement.
Well, I thought we had just arrived at that agreement until it comes down to actually doing it, and then you seem to have a change of heart. But Mr. Chairman, let's put that to the test. I see I'm out of time, but I think the sooner we move that, the better.
Very keen observation. The chair now recognizes Ms. Ballot, the gentlelady from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start by saying these issues are difficult for most Americans to talk about. And I want to bring us back to the basic dignity and humanity of all Americans, full stop. Ms. Reynolds, I really appreciate you being here today. I too am a parent, and I know that I would do anything that I could to get my children the care that they need. And implied in what you've said is that that journey was not always easy for you. And I'm wondering if we could bring it back to the experience of real parents, real Americans right now who are trying to wrestle with these issues. Just tell us a little bit more, if you could, about your experience of trying desperately to get your child the support that you felt like they needed and deserved, and you didn't always know what that was.
So when my child came out as transgender, there was not sort of the hysteria that there is now about this. So there was not a lot of information. We didn't know anyone. We didn't know other parents. We didn't know other kids. So if you can imagine late nights on the internet trying to find any information, lots and lots of tears, lots and lots of discussions with my husband. What are we going to do? How are we going to support our child? And then we sort of put to the test the social transition, and then we spoke with experts, right? And we took our time and we learned and we grew. And as our child matured, you know, that sort of changed things too. It was painful.
Yeah.
I don't want to, you know, I sort of don't want to focus on the negative of all of this, but it was extremely painful for us. It wasn't an easy choice. It wasn't anything that we took lightly. We took this extremely seriously. We were trying to get it right.
Yeah. And so is it fair to say that you tried to put the needs of your child at the center of all the decisions that you were making, difficult decisions in the face of a lot of stigma, a lot of misunderstanding, and you said recently the hysteria around this. And does the added stigma make it more difficult for parents in this situation to have the courage to stand up for their children? Like, what is that like when you feel like you are trying desperately to do the right thing and you're hearing all of these voices that you are not being a good parent?
It's absolutely heartbreaking, actually. I've spent my entire career trying to help people, particularly children. That is what I do. And to sort of be looked at as a child abuser or, you know, an indoctrinator or something like that, it's extremely painful. It just adds a whole other layer to this. It feels very hateful and divisive.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I think there are a lot of parents across the country right now that are trying their level best to do right by their children. And this kind of heightened hysteria around this issue is making it very difficult for them to do that. So I wanted to bring this hearing back to basic humanity and dignity, because I feel like we have gone astray. That's the first thing I want to say. So thank you for being here. For Ms. Cole, I also want to thank you for being here. I'm very sorry you feel like you didn't get the care that you needed and deserved.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Minter, you're welcome.
If-
Mr. Minter, if you could, talk to us about how gender-affirming care, what does that look like for young kids? What are we talking about when we talk about gender-affirming care for young children?
For young children, we're simply talking about parental love and support, not trying to change the child, recognizing that the child is transgender and allowing them to be who they are, and encouraging others, family members, to do the same. It's really just loving and supporting a child.
I really appreciate that. Again, let's bring it back to the basic humanity and dignity of all. The last thing I want to say is, in his opening statements, the chair said there's no such thing as gender assigned at birth, and I just want to be on the record here of standing up for the 5.6 million Americans who are intersex, and actually that's exactly what the experience that they had was. They were having their gender assigned at birth, and they are Americans too, and they are trying to navigate this. There are atypical chromosome patterns, gonads, and genitals that do not fit typical binary notions of male and female. That does not make them less American or less legitimate or less worthy of dignity and respect. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, brave ladies, for being here today. I greatly appreciate it, and I admire your bravery in these times. Many of my colleagues on the left like to discuss gender-affirming care and claim that puberty blockers and hormone therapy and sex reassignment surgery are the only ways to treat gender dysphoria. Once a child expresses a feeling of gender dysphoria, instead of questioning the root cause of that feeling, that child will more likely than not be on a fast track to gender reassignment surgery, or otherwise known as genital mutilation. But I want you to imagine something. What would happen if we affirmed every thought that our children have? I'd like to show you a food pyramid. Now I know what you're thinking. This is not the FDA's approved food pyramid, although many of you probably wish it was. This is the food pyramid according to my 4-year-old and my 2-year-old daughters. And by the way, in the Hunt house, we don't do Ben & Jerry's. It's Bluebell only. If my children had their way, they would have ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and for every single meal in between. Oh, the wisdom of children. But in a sane country, we know that children are mature enough to make adult decisions that will impact the rest of their lives. That's why we have parents. Children cry for ice cream, but as parents, we have the wisdom to know that ice cream is not in their best interest, particularly their long-term interest. I want to thank my parents, Willie and Diane Hunt. They had 3 children. All 3 of us went to West Point. All 3 of us served our country. All 3 of us earned multiple master's degrees from Ivy League schools. Do you know why? Because my parents did not give in to the thoughts of an adolescent Wesley Hunt. I am a United States congressman because my parents didn't listen to me when I was 8 years old. They raised us. They cared for us. They taught us the ways of being successful people. As an adult, you could do whatever you want with your body and with your own money. You're mature, you're fully grown, you can make adult decisions. I'm a combat veteran. I fought for the right for you as an adult to make your own decisions, but in my opinion, children are a different story. It is our obligation to protect them. When it comes to gender dysphoria in children, many in the American medical establishment have absolutely lost their minds. A child will tell their parent they have thoughts of gender dysphoria, and the parent may take that child to a doctor. But the doctor, instead of questioning the root cause of the dysphoria, will instead affirm the child's thoughts and proceed with gender-affirming care. But as many as my colleagues on the left want you to believe, there isn't widespread agreement on how to treat gender dysphoria. I can assure you that child mutilation is not the answer. In fact, in Finland, Sweden, France, Norway, and the UK are reversing course and asking questions. In the UK, their only national gender clinic for children shut down last year by court order. What do their doctors know that our doctors don't? I'm sorry we're here right now. I'm sorry, Ms. Cole. We failed you. Ms. Scanlon, my daughters are going to watch this because you have become their new hero, and I can assure you that my 4-year-old and my 2-year-old daughters will not change in front of biological men. This is ridiculous. I don't care what party you are a part of. If you think that we are all equal and the same biologically, you've literally lost your mind. And when my 2 daughters work hard in the sport, work hard in their craft to be the best that they can be amongst other women, they will compete against other women. I owe Victoria and Olivia and every other young lady in this country that. If you think I'm wrong, I am not the problem. I can assure you. We have an opportunity in this country to get this right in 2024 so we could stop all of this foolishness. But I cannot thank you ladies enough for bringing this up. I apologize that we live in America where this is happening. But thank God for the American spirit fire, and thank God for brave women like you, because it's brave women like you that are going to turn the tide so that future women won't have to suffer in the same way that you have. God bless you. Thank you so much for being here. I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair next recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to quote Judge Moody from Arkansas, a federal judge. Thank you. He said the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is made by a clinician who assesses whether a patient meets criteria based on a clinical interview, the clinician's observations of the patient, and the reports of the minor's parents. This is how diagnosis of other mental health conditions are generally made. Gender dysphoria is a serious condition that, if left untreated, can result in other psychological conditions, including depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicidal behavior, and impairment in functioning. So these things need to be discussed and determined in a scientific manner and a logical manner, not emotion, not behavior and attitudes that appeal only to voters and to try to gain votes at the ballot box. This should be done responsibly. Transgender people have been around for a long time, and they have rights, and they need to be respected. I read Ms. Scanlon's testimony. I wasn't here to hear it, and I think Penn didn't deal with your situation like they could have and should have in putting up some type of different barriers in the women's area of the locker room, but that's another issue. But things should be dealt with in a different way. This is an easy way for people to try to get points. Pick on a minority group that is the most minority and least understood in our country. And it's gone on for centuries. 100 years ago, it was African Americans. Later, it was Hispanics. Then it was gay people. Now it's transgendered people. Find a group that is not understood and is easy to use to gain political power. It is bad for politics. It's bad for people. Should use science. Parents have rights in raising their children. Athletes have rights. There's a connection. We need to figure out the right answer. And to get the right answer, we need to ask the Medical Association and the Psychiatric Association to choose the people that come before us to testify and give us their opinions on the right way to deal with this issue. Not each group picking people that are favorable to them to put out divergent issues, but people who are experts based on the AMA and the American Psychiatric Association and maybe another association similar, where they pick the witnesses and send them to us to talk about the issue and to suggest a response that would be both fair to the transgendered parent, the transgendered child, and the society at large. The Republicans didn't want vaccines and face masks, and they argued that parental rights were sacrosanct then, and parents had a right to direct health care decisions for children. Well, a lot of people died. Tens and hundreds of thousands of people died because they didn't get vaccinated. In gender-affirming surgery, Republicans think the government should make these sensitive decisions. Not necessarily the case. They also believe Americans only have access to health care if their health care decisions match Republican radical beliefs. Republicans fought against the Affordable Care Act. They fought and refused to expand Medicaid in states, leaving millions without health care coverage, 120,000 in my state, Tennessee, not getting health care coverage when the federal government would fund it. They passed countless abortion bans depriving women of safe reproductive health care. They've spread misinformation and tried to undercut medical experts during the COVID pandemic, particularly in Florida. And now they're trying to limit gender-affirming care for transgender youth. By limiting access to health care, wedging their right-wing ideology into the exam room, and substituting their personal beliefs for the professional judgment of doctors, they are causing needless suffering. In the past 2 Congresses, I chaired this subcommittee. When the Republicans took control, they changed the name, which used to be the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties Subcommittee. They changed it to Constitution, I imagine, with a small c, and limited government. Civil rights and civil liberties were out the window. I was disappointed, not totally surprised, that civil rights and civil liberties were removed. What I didn't understand is, however, this has anything to do with limited government. This does not have anything to do with limited government. There's nothing limited about asserting the preferences and beliefs of federal legislators into individual health care decisions about young people. It's intrusive and it's dangerous. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, but first seek unanimous consent to allow the gentleman from Florida, member of the full committee, to participate and have the time waived to him for the subcommittee proceedings.
Mr. Chairman, I object. No, I withdraw the objection.
Thank you. Thank you. And the chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Fry.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield my 5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Matt Gaetz.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Ms. Scanlon, we just heard my Democrat colleague, Mr. Cohen, say that your circumstance could have been fully resolved if we'd have just had some barriers up in the women's showers. Do you think that that's a sufficient way to resolve what we're dealing with here?
I think by Representative Cohen admitting that we need barriers acknowledges there are biological differences between men and women. And by acknowledging that we need to have private spaces that are separate from each other, why can't we just use the locker rooms that we've always used, the men's and the women's? If you're acknowledging that we need protection and privacy from these men, then you're acknowledging that the locker rooms we've always used are the correct ones.
My next question is for Shannon Minter. Are you familiar with the changes in law recently in Washington State regarding transgender youth?
Yes.
And as I understand it, it used to be the case in Washington State that if a youth showed up at an emergency shelter, there was a legal requirement to notify the parent within 72 hours in the absence of some abuse or neglect. Is that your understanding of what the law was then?
I believe that is correct.
And then the law changed, where now in Washington State, if someone shows up to one of these shelters who's a minor and says that their parents don't agree with them changing their gender, that the shelter no longer has to notify the parents within 72 hours and can instead notify a government authority. Do I have that right?
The parents will be notified. There's no question about that. This simply allows for a delay in order to allow them to investigate to make sure this child is going to be safe. There's no question that the parents will be notified.
How long should parents have to wait, not knowing where their child is, while a government process is playing out to make a gender determination?
There's no reason to treat these situations with transgender young people who may be in danger or at risk of abuse at home any differently than we would treat any other child, where we have reasonable basis to worry about that and to investigate that.
But it does treat them differently.
A short delay to protect the safety of young people is always warranted.
But how long is the delay? How long do you want a parent not knowing where their kid is because the kid says they want to change their gender? Just tell me how long a delay you think is appropriate.
I want authorities to treat these kids with the same care they treat all other children.
No, but
it will be a short delay, and the parents will be notified.
Because you won't tell us how long a delay. So if you're watching this, just imagine you're that parent and you don't know where your child is. And the law now says there's a 72-hour period where the shelter has to notify you in that 72-hour period for any child of any gender or any circumstance is a period to investigate whether there's abuse in the home. But beyond that, beyond 72 hours, you got to tell the parent. And so it's really important to understand here what the proponents of radical gender ideology want. They want to stand between a parent and a child on these important decisions. And I don't think it's abuse if a parent says, I'm not going to get my child gender blockers. And it's odd to hear you advocate for the law because just moments ago in testimony, you said, and I wrote it down, parents have a fundamental right to make healthcare decisions regarding their children. But if in Washington state today, the parent makes the decision that they're not going to provide that gender-affirming care, what it does is it unlocks for the government a window of time to keep the child away from the parent and to not tell the parent where the kid is. Oh, please, get over yourself. What's terrible is when you have this incongruent desire of the government to restrain the ability of parents to parent. And I can only imagine the terror that a parent must go through not knowing where their child is. So I think that's really challenging. We've also seen in the state of Alaska, Title IX, which was established for girls' sports to be used as a justification to socially transition a child against their wishes. Ms. Scanlon, as a beneficiary of Title IX, as a female athlete, do you think Title IX should be used in that way?
Absolutely not. Swimming did a lot of really good things for my life after I'm a sexual assault survivor, and swimming was one of the only things that I had to keep me going when I was struggling with that. And to think about young girls that are not going to be given those same opportunities because Title IX is being reworked and rewritten for these new people that have different definitions of what a woman is.
Yeah, I'm against transitioning children against the will of their parents, and I'm against transitioning Title IX away from an asset for women's sports to this strange social justice cause that is deeply misguided. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I'd seek unanimous consent to introduce into the record an article entitled, "No, Washington did not just pass a law allowing the state to kidnap and transgenderify children."
Without objection.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my questioning, I have to say this has been so deeply disturbing on a number of levels. And what we have seen today is what we've been seeing this entire Congress, which is an effort by my Republican colleagues and indeed some of the more extreme voices in the Republican Party to keep Americans on a treadmill of rage. Whatever the latest issue is that they want people to be angry about, they do their best to keep Americans on a treadmill of rage. And they get their Fox or Newsmax or whatever right-wing media outlet of the moment is, they get their viewers, they get a clip from this hearing that gets displayed, it gets put on Twitter, and they make money. That's what all of this is all about, unfortunately. I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record a couple of articles. The first is Gender-Affirming Surgeon Speaks at Jacobs School event, dated June 9th, 2023.
Without objection.
And that article, we saw a clip earlier of Dr. Blair Peters, and had Dr. Peters actually been here, he could have helped dispel some myths. In fact, in the article, you'll find Dr. Peters saying very explicitly, transgender kids do not get surgery, Dr. Peters said, directly refuting a key talking point for those trafficking in anti-trans rhetoric. The other article I'd like to enter, I'd like unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to enter into the record is an article entitled, "I Don't Want to Live in This State of Terror Anymore. Some families with trans children are leaving Texas." If I could have unanimous consent to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Minter and Ms. Reynolds, thank you for being here to dispel some of these myths and to fight back against this effort to keep Americans on this treadmill of anger and rage. I'd also, Ms. Reynolds, I want to apologize to you. One of my Republican colleagues made some really demeaning and belittling comments meant to humiliate and minimize the parents of trans children by comparing the very difficult, painful journey and conversation with children about transitioning to allowing kids to eat ice cream all day, every day. So I want to apologize on behalf of what happened. And I want to congratulate you for your courage to speak on behalf of your child and other children. I'd like to ask you, Ms. Reynolds, I entered into the record this article about Texas. And Texas has been a very hostile state to vulnerable populations. Can you tell me, and I listened very carefully to your journey, but can you tell us what happens when the government marshals all of its energy and resources to harm families like yours?
It's absolutely terrorizing, is what it does. It's very, it creates another level of stress, and I mean, I really can't even understate that, overstate that. It's terrorizing. It really is. It's extremely stressful. It's extremely distracting. It produces all kinds of fear. I would have left Texas already if that were something that was financially feasible for my family, and it's not. My career is in Texas. My children are established there. They have their friends. They have their schools. They're there. We're here. And but because of this, I would have been, a political refugee to another state if I could afford to do that. So we have no choice but to try to at least tell our story and see if anybody can hear sort of something a little more rational, something a little more like what families like mine are experiencing.
Thank you so much, Ms. Reynolds. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, if Congress really wanted to protect children, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would have joined with us in passing robust, comprehensive gun violence prevention legislation that would truly protect children. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Kyler.
I yield back to the chair.
Thank you for yielding the time. Dr. Bowens, can you define what gender dysmorphia is?
Dysmorphia or dysphoria?
Well, is those two different terms?
Yes, so gender dysphoria is a diagnosis in the DSM, which is what we're talking about, I think.
Yes. So is it increasing among our children now, this gender dysphoria?
Yes, the diagnosis has increased, I believe even from 2021 to current, there was a 40% increase. The other thing is that we've also had a proliferation of gender clinics. So 10 years ago, there was just maybe a few, and now all of a sudden, there are tons of gender clinics with a really steep curve of surgical markets expected to increase.
So do you think social media has any role in this increase in gender dysphoria?
Absolutely. We know that kids are being influenced. I mean, I have a list of, there are 40,000 subscribers to a detransitioning site, and I have a list of people who are willing to testify, not to mention those who are silent. But I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Well, just about the role of social media and
yes.
the influences there.
So social media, especially with this age cohort, has a very important role. The unfortunate thing, and which is actually the compassionate thing, would be if we were to begin to research why is there such an increase in diagnoses of gender dysphoria, and not just our pat answer of more people feel comfortable coming out. No, why has the demographic flipped from mostly biological males experiencing gender dysphoria to biological females? So we don't have answers to those questions, and yet we're plowing ahead with this kind of, these procedures anyway.
Well, the evidence seems to show that there's sort of a rush to force gender transition or sex change procedures on children. Are we imagining that, or do you think that's actually happening?
No, I don't think we're imagining that. I wish that some of the experiences that we've heard reported today were accurate for the population at whole, but that's not what we're seeing. I mean, you could go on Planned Parenthood's website and see that if you want testosterone or estrogen prescription, you can go there and get it in an hour. You know, you don't have to go through a rigorous assessment. I think if we had those markers in place, then you'd see kids not running towards this kind of transition, because I think the number is around 78% come to a clinical setting with at least 3 other, or at least some kind of diagnosis other than gender dysphoria.
I think it's an obvious fact that there are some industries that stand to benefit financially from all these procedures and all this experimentation. Are you aware of European nations putting a pause on gender transition procedures for minors?
Yes. I mean, and I think that's the issue that we're asking for. This is the compassionate issue. Let's review the literature.
Yeah.
Let's review, what does the science actually say? And not just from people who are supporters, either way, but what does the science say? And then what we're seeing is countries like the UK that shut down the Tavistock clinic. You're seeing other countries like Finland, Norway, et cetera, that once they actually look at the science that's used to support these procedures, they back away from it because the evidence is actually very weak.
And there's no reliable studies on long-term effects. We don't know.
The longest one we have is Sweden, because it goes 10 years. And the reality is that a lot of people don't experience regret until like 5 to 7 years after they've gone through these procedures.
I'll have more time for questions for the panel. I know Ms. Cole's about to hit that button. I'm coming back to you, so I'll have more time. But I just want to note that on May 13th of 2021, a subcommittee member here on Judiciary, our colleague, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee, who walked in the room, I'm going to quote you because you said, and I think it's up on the screen there, in essence, the brain doesn't fully mature until at least 25 years old. Does that tell us about high school students, middle schoolers, and yes, young people who make rash or irreverent or spontaneous decisions? Should that be their life? Now, admittedly, she was saying this in the context of a criminal subcommittee hearing, but I think that is a truism. I think she stated an obvious fact that everybody should acknowledge. Unfortunately, I'm out of time. I'll have some more in a bit. The chair now recognizes Ms. Jackson-Lee. How about that introduction?
Mr. Johnson, thank you for giving me that gift. You are absolutely right. That hearing, if I might quote it specifically, as the chair of the committee, it was made during a committee hearing entitled The Juvenile Justice Pipeline and the Road Back to Integration. The idea, Ms. Reynolds and Mr. Minter, was to save lives from young people being incarcerated for life. And it was the individual young person making rash actions that would draw themselves into criminal life or criminal acts, should that be the rest of their life. So let me not step away from the idea that we want to save lives in many instances. Let me get to the point of this hearing, since that was not relevant to this hearing and it was on a completely different topic. But let me get to this point. Let me apologize for a hearing that frightens me. I have dealt with this issue for decades, and I dealt with a young man named David Ritchie, who was a gay young man, a young man, who in the place he lived, Texas, his life was not affirmed. He lived in a skin of concern and fear, and ultimately he was sodomized. And we introduced legislation of the David Ritchie anti-hate legislation because as a gay young man who lived life differently, he was not affirmed. Ultimately, even though got past this case, he ultimately committed suicide. So let me, as I begin my questioning, tell you how fearful I am that the intervention of this committee on issues of private healthcare determination frighteningly labeled the trans community in a way that someone is being intimidated, in fear, and concern for their life, or their personal thinking is that they're not worthy, they're not entitled to good health care, and that their life is not worth it. I insist on pronouncing today, your life is worth it. Your son's life is worth it. Daughter's life is worth it. However they are transitioning and as they live their life. And I plead and beg for those who might be listening, know that we do not believe that this is a question for this committee. It is a question for health care, for your parent or loved one or guardian, and as well, your personal determination. I will not pretend to be a scriptured person. I am not ordained. I'm not in any leading religious organization as a religious leader, but I have spoken to persons who lead, and they've given me no evidence that this issue speaks to anyone's religion. Again, I don't pretend to know every aspect of everyone's faith, and in this country, you practice as you desire. But I will not sit here and allow the trans community to be abused and in essence to be rejected. And for someone somewhere, let me say, your life is worthwhile. Mr. Mentor, let me provide you with a question very quickly. My time is short. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment forbids states to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. And the Supreme Court has stated this clause includes a substantive component that provides heightened protection against government interference. What does this mean to the interests? The court stated that the interests of parents in the care and custody of control of their children is important. Please give what this means to you as you lead out in this community. Ms. Reynolds, please let us know what this meant to you for your son, for his coming together, and how you needed the support of your community, your surrounding, and how important this is for the trans. Let me go to Mr. Mentor, please. And I'd ask the chairman for his indulgence, so I had to respond to his commentary. Yes, Mr. Mentor.
Thank you so much for your statement of support for this community. Kids need to hear that. Yes, these state bans are an unthinkable intrusion on the traditional, deeply rooted authority of parents to make medical decisions for their own children. And we're talking about obtaining established care. These are parents who know there's an effective treatment. They see their child suffering. To have the government come in and say, no, you cannot obtain this health care for your children is a shocking violation of parents' rights.
Psychologically, Ms. Reynolds, if you can just bring it home to us what it really means, and who somebody that's not in this room might be seeing what's going on here.
I just want to highlight how incredibly difficult all of this was. This is, again, nothing that we arrived on easily. There was nothing impulsive about any of this decision. It was made collaboratively with a team of trained professionals. There was a ridiculous amount of assessment that happened prior to that. This is not just some kind of fly-by-night, my kid said this one day and then this whole thing launched. That is not how this went down. It was very, very, very careful.
Are others impacted by listening to this? Quickly, can you just say what impact, hearing that they are not affirmed?
It's devastating.
Gentlelady's out of time.
I yield back, thank you.
Thank you. And the chair yields next to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Thank the chair. I thank the witnesses for being here. Ms. Scanlon, is Leah Thomas a man or a woman?
Leah Thomas is biologically male.
Did the University of Pennsylvania attempt to silence or censor you or any of your teammates when the news broke about a member of the team swim team would be joining your female swim team?
We had already known at this point that Thomas would be joining our team, and the university advised us to seek counseling if we objected.
Did they try to silence you all in terms of voicing your opinions?
Yes, in fact, I wrote an opinion piece for the school newspaper that was quickly retracted because it was too offensive to be written and published.
Offensive that you were concerned about a biological male competing against you and undressing in a locker room with you and others, that would be, quote, offensive, end quote.
Yes.
What steps did the University of Pennsylvania take to platform Leah Thomas over you and your female teammates?
The University of Pennsylvania nominated Leah Thomas for NCAA Women of the Year. In fact, I found this to be very offensive because there are plenty of other female athletes at the University of Pennsylvania that are very strong and very worthy of that nomination.
Are you familiar with the International Swimming Federation?
Yes.
Do you consider it to be some bastion of right-wing conspiracy or somehow a conservative right-wing organization?
No.
Did the International Swimming Federation ban Leah Thomas from competing at the 2024 Paris Olympics?
Yes, the governing body of swimming put in laws to say that individuals that have gone through male puberty are not permitted to compete in women's competitions.
So, a question for you, Ms. Cole, and first of all, thank you for being here. I've heard some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle use words like, this frightens me, this hearing. They're frightened by us having a hearing in which you are able to speak to the world about what you have gone through. And I've heard colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, life is worth it, in the context of pushing a particular worldview and saying life is worth it. I would just ask to say that I just want to make sure that you know, like from our standpoint, that your life is worth it, and that the people that have gone through this, that your lives are worth it. And I'd wondered if you'd like to comment on the worth of your life and the social pressures and the pressure placed on you to pursue a path that you now believe was not the correct path.
I think we're all on the same page here, that everybody's life and right to happiness is worthy. And that's what we're all fighting for, even if we don't necessarily agree on what that means. And if I may ask, would I be able to address another witness?
Through the chair, you may. So you may
Okay.
speak to me and reference any other testimony you wish to.
Okay. Well, Mrs. Reynolds.
And you can direct it to me and say that what Ms. Reynolds talked about, you want to respond to, and you go ahead.
Well, I understood that Mrs. Reynolds is scared for her child. And I just want to set the record straight that I don't hate her. I don't think anybody in this room hates her. In fact, I see my own mother and my own father in her, and that she dearly loves her child. And she's doing the best with what she's been given. And unfortunately, it's not much. And for that, I'm sorry. I mean, I think every parent deserves the utmost grace and guidance with how to help their child. That being said, I don't wish for her child to have the same result as I did. I don't wish for anybody to regret transition or to detransition because it's incredibly difficult. It comes with its own difficulties, and it's not easy. And I hope that her child gets to have a happy and fulfilling adulthood, however that may look like.
Well, thank you for that, Ms. Cole. I think it was heartfelt, and I know that a number of us share your view. One last question as my time is winding down. Do you believe that the American healthcare system failed you?
On every single level.
Thank
My
you.
doctors and systemically.
Thank you for being here. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 articles. First, social contagion isn't causing more youth to be transgender. That's NBC News, August 2nd, 2022. And study finds no evidence of social contagion among transgender youth, August 3rd, 2022, American Academy of Pediatrics.
I have some
Without objection.
Your time starts.
Another? Yes.
Oh, you have?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I was hoping you'd come again. Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Human Rights Watch attacks on gender-affirming care by state, but I just want to show this map and just indicate how personal I think these decisions are. And Ms. Cole has indicated how personal it is. And you have too, Ms. Reynolds. Thank you. Unanimous consent. Also, a hole in our hearts, family, friends mourn murder victim China Gibson. Another, as unanimous consent, China Gibson identified as the 5th transgender woman killed in 2017. This is related, and I'm introducing the China Gibson, Stop Murdering Black Trans Today, and Planned Parenthood Texas affiliates and PPFA Move for Decision in Baseless Medicaid False Claims Act, particularly attacked because of their work in trans-affirming healthcare. Ask unanimous consent for those to be placed into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection. And the chair now recognizes the ranking member, Ms. Scanlon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses. We appreciate you being here to share your experiences and help everybody understand both the very personal stories that are implicated in this issue, as well as some of the political agendas that are being pushed. It is remarkable that our majority colleagues were not able to find any medical professionals to back their claims in today's hearing, other than an edited video of someone who actually has refuted their conclusions. And much of what we've heard today really is playing to and from some of the furthest extremes of right-wing ideology and fear-mongering. Mr. Minter, our colleagues and witnesses have expressed concern about the participation of transgender students on athletic teams aligning with their gender identities, even while conceding several times now that to the extent this is a concern in competitive athletics, the athletic governing bodies are addressing this issue for competitive athletes. Can you further comment?
Yeah, this transgender students, transgender girls and women have been playing on sports teams for a long time now. Only recently has this become weaponized as a political issue. We, sports associations, high school athletic associations, governing sports bodies, local school districts have long been able to deal with this issue as they should by looking at relevant factors like age, sport, level of competition, individual circumstances. This is a classic solution in search of a problem. The real problem, if there is one, is the one Ms. Reynolds identified, which is still so difficult for transgender kids to participate at all or to receive any encouragement and support.
Right, and that has been one of the primary concerns that we've been hearing from families as they have kids who just want to be kids and participate in sports. And because of the weaponization of this issue, it's become a problem. So thank you for that. We've also heard conservative lawmakers and activists argue that bans on gender-affirming care are necessary to protect minors, with many labeling gender-affirming treatments experimental, and as we've seen here today repeatedly, deliberately confusing gender-affirming care with gender transition surgery. Can you speak to that issue?
Again, surgery is an adult treatment. That is not what we're talking about with children and youth. And there have been now 6 court cases, including 2 complete full trials, where these states have had the opportunity to substantiate the claim that this treatment is experimental. They have no evidence of that. And again, courts across a wide variety of judges have concluded that this is not experimental care. It is well established, it's well founded, there's extensive clinical research showing the benefits. And this is just what ordinarily happens in our healthcare system, which is parents with their children and their healthcare providers making reasonable medical decisions to help their own children.
Thank you. If you had about 30 seconds to address any additional concerns, what would you say?
The UK still provides health care to transgender young people. They shut down the one clinic that used to provide all the care in order to open up multiple regional clinics to serve more children. The Swedish study's been referred to here a number of times today. It's so important. That study lends zero credence to the notion that these treatments are not effective. And the author of that study has repeatedly expressed great distress at the way her study has been misrepresented. She strongly opposes bans on health care for transgender youth.
Thank you. We have heard a lot of misinformation, probably firmly held personal beliefs, but that may be at odds with the facts. So I want to correct some of that for the record, Mr. Chairman. I would seek unanimous consent to enter the following items into the record. A letter from leading medical organizations to Congress opposing efforts to ban gender-affirming care.
Without objection.
A letter from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights in support of laws and policies that promote transgender, non-binary, and intersex people from discrimination.
Without objection.
An opinion by the U.S. District Court in Arkansas, which was later affirmed by the Eighth Circuit Court, which has a very complete assessment of the legal and factual basis for this discussion. It found a statewide ban on gender-affirming care to be in violation of the 14th Amendment.
Without objection.
A Human Rights Campaign FAQ on gender-affirming care for anyone who has questions about what's actually going on.
Without objection.
A policy paper from Women's Sports Foundation entitled Participation of Transgender Athletes in Women's Sports. I'm almost done.
Without objection.
And a New York Times article entitled How a Campaign Against Transgender Rights Mobilized Conservatives.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Scanlon, the ranking member just said this is simply about letting kids compete and that the sports governing bodies are addressing this. So I would just ask you two questions. Is Leah Thomas a kid?
No.
And is the NCAA appropriately and in the right way, in your judgment, addressing this situation?
They did not during our season. They said that Olympians deserve protections, but collegiate level athletes, grassroots level athletes, middle schoolers, high schoolers did not deserve those same protections.
So in your judgment, the chairman calling this hearing is not a waste of time, as the ranking member said. We're trying to get to the bottom of a real concern that's impacting all kinds of young ladies who participate in collegiate athletics.
Yes, and I would like to say that while there's been a lot of notions that this is such a minority group of people, this one transgender athlete, Leah Thomas, affected hundreds of girls. There were hundreds of girls at the NCAA championship that were in tears over the situation, whether it be getting bumped out of their spots in competition, failing to qualify for the meet, or having to change in the locker room next to a 6'4" biological male. This is not a minority group that is being affected by this.
I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and thank the chairman for his work, and I yield to the chairman.
Thank you. Thank you for yielding. Quick question for Mr. Minter. You yourself transitioned at age 35 and not as a child, correct?
That is correct. I wish I'd been able to do so earlier.
All right. Ms. Cole, I want to thank you again for being here today and for sharing your powerful testimony, especially on your 19th birthday, and that has been very helpful to us.
Thank you, sir.
I want to acknowledge what you said earlier, tearfully. It was appropriate. Everyone here, as you said, our hearts go out to everybody, the families, everybody affected. We're trying to strike the right balance, and we do believe Congress has a role here. And I appreciate your testimony for providing evidence of that. And I wanted to ask you first about your parents' involvement in your transition process, and then ask you about some of the hormone treatments you underwent, because I think all that's important. First, were you or your parents informed of the long-term effects of the procedures and hormones that you were subjected to?
We had consent forms with a list of some of the side effects, and we did do consultations where we did speak about some of them, but it was in very vague terms. And I mean, as a child, it was a lot for me to process because, I mean, I was perfectly healthy, and children tend to think that they're invincible, that nothing can get them. And with all these things being listed, it was hard to know which of these I would experience. And most of the side effects that I experienced, most of the ones that I'm experiencing today, actually, were not even listed on these forms, so I had no idea. And children just don't know what permanence is because they've only been in the world for so many years.
It's an important legal principle that we have informed consent, fully informed consent for life-altering medical procedures. And are you then suggesting that it was not really full informed consent?
I mean, no matter how much information they would have given me, as a child, I just would not have been able to consent to this. And my parents were required to sign off on these, but it was under duress. I don't think it was really consent. It was coercion. They were given the false dichotomy of either a child transitions or she dies. But transition almost killed me.
And the evidence suggests that that is a common practice, regardless of what's been said here today. And there's some other things that are very disturbing. One aspect of the current child movement about, this sex change movement that's particularly pernicious is the so-called off-label medications. One that's well known as leuprolide acetate, or it's commonly known as Lupron, to chemically alter boys and girls, not by surgery, but chemically, it's
Yes.
the same thing. There's a long list of pharmaceutical drugs that medical personnel across the country are using to, for example, shut off the testosterone production in young boys to make them more feminine looking, or to shut off the estrogen production in young girls to make them more masculine looking. So I'm going to say for the record, post-hearing, we have 5 days. I'll enter some of the articles that detail a list of these chemical drugs being used on children for purposes that are not approved by the FDA. But Ms. Cole, was one of those puberty blockers that you were prescribed Lupron?
Yes, I was put on Lupron.
And what was the purpose of that in your hormone treatment?
Just to stop the natural production of my hormones to make way for the exogenous testosterone.
Does it concern you, as it does us, that some pharmaceuticals are being used to chemically mutilate some children today that were never explicitly approved for that purpose by the FDA?
Incredibly so.
And to my knowledge, there's currently no effort underway by the FDA to explicitly approve these pharmaceuticals for these purposes.
And they shouldn't.
And they shouldn't. The time's expired for the time that was yielded to me, and I thank the chairman. And now I recognize myself for my 5 minutes finally, so I'll keep going here. The last time I checked, it was still illegal under federal law to use FDA-approved pharmaceuticals for an unapproved or off-label use, and yet we're seeing that very commonly in this field. Ms. Cole, do you find it concerning that medications that were used on you or on countless other children across the country for a reason contrary to the original purpose they were approved for, you've said that's something that concerns you, disturbs you, shouldn't be allowed, right?
Very much so.
Ms. Mailman, let me go to you. There's been a lot of talk here in recent few minutes about legal precedents, et cetera. I saw you sort of biting your lip as some of that was presented. I'll give you a moment here to refute any of that or respond to it, if you will.
Right, well, we've heard a lot about the parents' rights to put drugs into their kids, which the Sixth Circuit has just very recently said that there is no Supreme Court case that extends this idea of parental rights to a general right to receive new or experimental drug treatments. And in general, this idea of substantive due process would strip people, would strip parents, would strip voters, would strip doctors of a say and push all of those decisions into our courts, which are not medical experts. So as the Sixth Circuit also recently said, life-tenured federal judges should be wary of removing a vexing and novel topic of medical debate from the ebbs and flows of democracy by construing a largely unamendable federal constitution to occupy the field. So that is what people are asking for. They're asking for judges to create medical law rather than voters informed by medical science.
That's right, and I think you've touched on a really important issue here, and it's one that's been discussed a little bit today, and that is, Mr. McClintock said it eloquently, we're conservatives, we're limited government conservatives, right? We obviously recognize that parents have a natural and fundamental right to the upbringing of their children, to make decisions with regard to their care and custody and control, but at the same time, our legal system in this country, our law, does not allow a parent to physically or mentally abuse or harm a child, right? So what we're all trying to do here in a very reasoned way is to strike the balance, to make sure that we're not doing life-altering harm to young people who are not prepared for that. And in some of the states, like in California, Mr. McClintock's home state, they are pushing the parents out of the room, and they're doing this without their consent, and that is alarming, and it should be obviously unlawful. Let me switch the subject here. If doctors are using chemical castration drugs in an off-label fashion, that is for a purpose other than what they were approved for by the FDA, should doctors face legal consequences? What do you think about that?
So that is subject to medical malpractice charges. Also, states regulate the practice of medicine. So states are perfectly entitled to regulate what drugs that people can access themselves. And if you can regulate what people can access themselves, obviously that would confer to the child as well. Unfortunately, I think you're seeing this movement that states should not be able to regulate the practice of medicine and somehow federal judges should. But absolutely, medical malpractice suits should be available here. Unfortunately, you've seen the politicization of medical associations creating standards that are then informing doctors. And so I think that what this body could and should do is make sure that there are research, that there is science that are informing states so that their medical boards can make better decisions.
That's well said. Early in my legal career, I did medical malpractice defense, as was one of the areas, and the medical standard was a big thing. We had medical review panels in the state of Louisiana, as most states do, and they would look to the medical standard, and if the standard itself is not fully informed by studies that back it up, we have a broad-scale concern here. Can you define quickly, changing subjects, what a sanctuary state is in context of gender transition procedures for children?
So California has bragged that it is a sanctuary state as far as gender transition for minors. It has SB 107. There are copycat bills being introduced in other states, and it has two main provisions. One is that if a child goes to California to have a gender procedure, the California courts will take over the custody proceedings. So one parent can take a child away from their other parent, and then the California court can assert jurisdiction. That's one provision. The second provision is that in California, they will not give over any medical information if it relates to another state's transgender procedure laws. So California is priding itself on ripping families apart when you would think that if they have 170,000 homeless people living in the state, that they would focus on the benefits and improving the lives of Californians.
That's very well said, and in 7 seconds, I can't do any justice to any of you asking another question. I want to thank you all sincerely. This is an important hearing, and it was not an easy one for anybody, but it's a really important issue that we have to wrestle with on both sides of the aisle and in every state across the country, and many legislatures are doing that right now. And in my view, some are doing some really important work. So we have to determine what we're going to do at this level, and so your testimony, all of you, your testimony today was valuable for that purpose. This concludes, one more.
One more UC, thank you. An article entitled California Bill on Youth Mental Health Services has been distorted on social media, discussing the fact that California law does not authorize gender-affirming surgeries without parental consent.
I'm going to defer to the wisdom of my witness, but without objection, we'll admit that in the record. This concludes today's hearing. We thank our witnesses for appearing today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned.